outside South Station, where trains arrived with the weight of stories and the wind smelled faintly of rain and cold metal. A man in his 80s sat each afternoon on the same wooden bench near the taxi stand. People passed him by every day. Students, bankers, tourists with rolling suitcases, rarely looking twice. He was just another piece of the city's furniture. A man with a guitar. Old, silent, still. His name was Walter McBride. He wore a navy peacoat, a wool cap pulled low over his ears, and a scarf so worn it had likely seen more winters than most people walking past him. In his lap rested a beat-up Gibson acoustic guitar, its wood scratched and dulled, its case beside him half open, with a handful of coins inside. But Walter never looked at the money. He wasn't there for charity, he was there for the song. He never spoke, not a word, just played. Every day, without fail, a slow, haunting melody that drifted through the concrete air like a memory someone else had forgotten. A waltz, gentle, repetitive, sad, but not tragic. It was the kind of tune that made the noise of the city seem quieter, as if the very pavement paused to listen. Nobody knew the name of the piece. Most didn't stop long enough to care. Some assumed it was an old folk tune, maybe a hymn, maybe something he picked up in church or from a war film soundtrack. But Walter never took requests, never offered explanations, just played, always the same melody over and over. As though he had made a promise to someone, and it had to be kept, even if no one remembered who that someone was. Until one day, a grey, wind-whipped afternoon near Halloween, someone stopped. She was in her 40s, in a burgundy trench coat, carrying a stack of sheet music in a leather satchel. She paused when she heard the first few notes. Her eyes narrowed, her breath caught. Then, without a word, she sat beside him, stunned, staring ahead, as if a ghost had brushed her shoulder. Within seconds, tears filled her eyes, not soft, polite tears, not the kind you wipe quickly and move on. These were the tears of memory, of recognition, of something lost, and now found in a place no one expected, because that melody, it wasn't random. She had heard it before, as a child, late at night, in her mother's voice, humming it while brushing her hair, always ending with the same sentence. Someone once wrote this for me when the world was on fire, but she never knew who. Now, sitting beside a man she'd never seen before, she finally asked, her voice cracking, "What's this song called?" Walter paused, lifted his eyes for the first time in hours and spoke, just once, quietly. It was written on a cold night by someone who didn't come back. If this story touches your heart like it did mine while writing it, give it a like and subscribe. That's how we keep telling stories that move, inspire, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what happens next will change everything. To anyone walking past, Walter McBride was just another city shadow, the kind of figure that blurred into the architecture of Boston, into the soundscape of buses braking, pigeons fluttering, and phones ringing. He sat still, always in the same place near South Station, the guitar resting on his knees like a sleeping animal, his hands moving with that strange mix of fragility and precision that only time and sorrow can teach. But what no one could guess, what no one stopped long enough to learn, was that this man had once stormed the beaches of Normandy. Walter was 20 when he landed in France. A kid from New Jersey, raised in a row house by Irish parents who believed in duty and discipline, with a soft spot for old records and Sunday hymns. He didn't enlist out of patriotism, not at first. It was what everyone was doing. It was expected. What he didn't expect was to see his best friend torn apart by mortar fire in a French orchard, or to spend nearly a year in a German prisoner of war camp after being captured outside of Aachen. That camp, somewhere deep in the woods near the Harz Mountains, was where Walter learned to play guitar. The instrument was broken, patched together by a fellow POW named Frank Delaney, a jazz guitarist from Chicago who once played backup for Billie Holiday. Frank had found the guitar in the wreckage of a barn and restored it using wire from fencing, wood from bunk slats, and even animal gut for one of the strings. It didn't sound pretty, but it made music. And that music, in a place where everything else had been stripped away, meant more than food, more than warmth. It meant memory. It meant hope. One night, during one of the harshest winters of the war, Frank composed a melody. Simple, melancholic, beautiful. He didn't write it down. He played it once, then twice, and looked at Walter with a seriousness that overrode the cold and hunger. "If I don't make it," Frank said, "play it for her." Walter asked who her was. Frank just smiled. "You'll know." Frank died 2 weeks later of pneumonia. No doctor, no funeral, just a shallow grave and the sound of wind in the trees. Walter never forgot the melody. He played it quietly at night under his breath, with fingers too numb to hold a pick. When the war ended, Walter came home, not as a hero, but as someone emptied out. He didn't go back to school. He didn't chase music professionally. He worked in the post office, married once, divorced, no kids, no one to pass things on to, except the melody. Every day for decades, before work or after, he played, sometimes in his garage, later in the park. And when retirement came and the silence in his apartment grew too loud, he found a spot downtown where the world didn't ask too many questions, where he could sit unnoticed and keep a promise. The melody never changed. It was like a prayer. 6 chords, 3 variations, always ending on a sustained minor 7th. He never added lyrics, never tried to improve it. Because it wasn't his to change. It belonged to a man who died in the snow, thinking of someone he loved. It belonged to a time no one wanted to remember. And to a woman who, for all Walter knew, might not even be alive. He didn't know her name. He didn't need to. Because in the silence that followed each time he played that last note, he heard her. Not her voice, but the shape of her memory. A space someone once filled with laughter, or a letter, or a song she only heard once before it was gone. And so he played. Every day. Not for money, not for pity, not for attention, but because the melody still mattered, even if only to him. People passed. Some listened. Most didn't. Some dropped coins, others dropped glances. But no one ever stopped to ask. Until one October afternoon, with wind in the trees and grey clouds overhead, a woman did. Because sometimes music isn't written for the world. It's written for one soul who just hasn't heard it yet. The melody hadn't just struck a nerve, it had shattered something inside her. Emily Carter, a music teacher from Brookline, had only planned to cut through South Station on her way to the bookstore. But when she heard the guitar, those exact ghostly notes drifting through the chill of an October afternoon, her steps had slowed as if the air had thickened, her heartbeat changed, she stopped walking, and for a few seconds the city vanished. She didn't know the man, she didn't know the tune, and yet somehow she knew both. That song, it wasn't just familiar, it was embedded. A fragment of melody carried in the back of her mind for decades, surfacing now and then, or moments of quiet, like a shadow cast by something no longer present. As a child, she had heard it more times than she could count, hummed in the soft, low voice of her mother, usually during thunderstorms or on nights when the wind howled and the windows rattled. Her mother, Margaret, always sang it the same way, gently, with her eyes closed, her hands stroking Emily's hair, and always without fail, she'd whisper the same sentence as the last note faded. "Someone once wrote this for me when the world was breaking." Emily never knew what that meant. She asked once or twice, and her mother just smiled, not with joy, but with a softness that felt like grief wrapped in love. Over time, she stopped asking. Children sense when doors aren't meant to be opened. Now all grown, with students of her own and years of teaching under her belt, Emily sat on the bench beside the old man and listened again, not to analyze or perform, but to remember. She didn't cry because the melody was sad. She cried because it felt like coming home, to something that had never been explained, to a question that had never been answered. When she found the strength to speak, her voice was barely there. "What's this song called?" she asked. The man, Walter, looked at her, not confused, not surprised, almost relieved. "It was written on a cold night," he said, "by someone who didn't come back." She didn't press him. Not then, but she knew she had to understand. And there was only one place to begin: her mother's attic. That night, after cancelling her evening lessons, Emily drove to the house where she grew up, a quiet colonial on a maple-lined street, still heavy with the smell of old books and cedar chests. Her mother had passed away 2 years earlier, and though Emily had cleaned out the closets, she'd left the attic untouched, as if some part of her wasn't ready to finish the story. The attic was cold. Dust floated in the flashlight beam, and the boxes, her mother's life reduced to labeled cardboard, waited like unopened letters. In a wooden box marked "Margaret Keepsakes," she found it. A photograph, black and white, faded at the edges. A young woman, her mother, in a nurse's uniform, sitting in the grass beside a man in military fatigues, a crude guitar in his lap. They weren't smiling at the camera, they were looking at each other. On the back, in handwriting Emily didn't recognize, were the words, "If I don't come back, play it for me. FD." Her hands trembled. She looked again at the man in the photo, the jawline, the posture, the way he held the guitar, identical to the man from the bench. But it wasn't Walter, it was someone else, younger, sharper. And somehow, heartbreakingly, even in black and white, you could tell he didn't survive. Emily didn't sleep that night. She sat at her piano, staring at the photo, the melody repeating in her mind like a ghost that had finally remembered its name. And by morning, there was no question left. She had to go back. She had to ask Walter the question that had lived in silence for decades. Sometimes we don't inherit stories in words. Sometimes we inherit them in music and don't realize it until someone plays the first note. When Emily returned to South Station the next afternoon, the photograph wrapped in a scarf inside her bag. She felt something between anticipation and reverence, as if she were about to disturb a grave or open a letter never meant to be read. The streets bustled as always, people rushing with coffee cups and phones, unaware that she walked among them, carrying a question 50 years overdue. Walter was there. Same bench, same coat, same guitar. But this time he looked up when she approached. Not startled, but steady, as though he had known she'd return, as though this moment had already happened in his mind 100 times. She sat beside him slowly, then placed the photograph on his knee. Walter didn't speak. For nearly a full minute, he just looked at it. His fingers rested motionless on the strings. His shoulders stiffened, and then, very quietly, he traced the edge of the picture with his thumb, like one might touch the face of someone long gone in a dream. "This was taken in Belgium," he finally said, his voice gravel-soft. "March 1945, just a few weeks before the end." He didn't ask where she got it. He didn't ask how she found him. He knew. "His name was Frank Delaney," she said softly. "He played for Billie Holiday, didn't he?" Walter gave the faintest smile, a breath more than a gesture. "He did. And he had a temper like a busted amp. But he could play like no one else. Jazz, swing, gospel, even Bach. But that melody, the one you heard, that was his only original. He wrote it one night when he couldn't sleep. We were freezing. Rations were gone. And he just started playing. Said he had to get it out before it disappeared." Emily placed the photo in his lap, then showed him the back. The note. Walter nodded slowly. "He gave me that guitar the day before we got split up. We were being moved. Camp was relocating east. He was sick by then. We both knew he wouldn't survive the march." He looked up at her and there was nothing but honesty in his eyes. "I made him a promise. I said I'd play it for her. For my mother," Emily whispered. Walter froze. "She was Margaret back home," she continued. "But during the war, she went by Maggie, sometimes Red because of her hair. She was a field nurse stationed near Bastogne. She never told me who he was, only that she lost someone, and that a song was all she had left of him." Walter leaned back, closed his eyes. "I thought she'd died." "She didn't," Emily said, tears now threatening. "But something inside her did. She never remarried. Raised me alone, never played another note, but that melody, she sang it to me like a lullaby, and I never knew why." They sat in silence then, not the silence of absence, but of presence, the kind of quiet that holds things no words can carry. Walter looked out toward the street, where cars passed and people hurried, unaware that a wound in time had just opened and begun to heal. "She loved him," he said. "I think he loved her too," Emily answered. Walter nodded. "I love them both, in different ways." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Because in the way he held the guitar and in the weight of his words, Emily understood. Walter had not just been Frank's friend. He had loved Margaret too, from a distance, silently, respectfully. And after Frank died, Walter didn't try to take his place. He didn't write letters, he didn't search the records. He simply carried the melody, not as a gift to be claimed, but as a torch to be passed. He had become a vessel, the guardian of a song that belonged to love itself. "I want to teach it," Emily said suddenly, "to my students, to everyone. I want them to know it didn't die in that camp." Walter smiled, not with his mouth, but with his whole body, a soft exhale of peace. "You should," he said. And for the first time in years, he reached into the guitar case and pulled out a folded piece of paper, handwritten chords and notations, his own version, carefully transcribed again and again over decades. "It's yours now." Emily held it like scripture. Some songs aren't written to be famous. They're written to survive, to carry love beyond memory. Walter had never imagined himself inside a classroom again, especially not one filled with teenagers in hoodies, tapping their pens and checking their phones, their backpacks strewn across the floor like sleeping dogs. But when he stepped into Emily's high school music room, the walls lined with posters of Duke Ellington and Joni Mitchell, something in him softened. He stood quietly for a moment, letting the air settle around him, letting the smell of sheet music, wood polish and teenage energy wash over him like a distant memory. Emily introduced him simply. "This is Mr. McBride. He's not here to give a lecture. He's here to tell you a story, not with words, but with music." And so Walter sat down, guitar in hand, hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from weight. The weight of years, of silence, of all the times he had played this song for ghosts. But today was different. He played Promised Winter slowly, not flawlessly, but intentionally. Every note lingered, every chord felt lived in, and by the time he reached the final fading progression, the room was still. No one looked at their phones. No one whispered. Some of the students had tears in their eyes, even though they didn't know why. Because some melodies don't need explanation. They simply speak to what we've forgotten how to say. Over the next few weeks, Emily invited Walter back, again and again, not just as a guest, but as a part of the program. She redesigned her winter curriculum around the song, assigning essays, research projects, and group arrangements. Students began to explore the history of World War II through music, learning not only about battles and politics, but about those who came home with burdens no one could see. They read about POW camps, about nurses on the front lines, about love letters that never reached their destination. Walter, at first hesitant, began to open up, not with speeches, but with stories, offered in fragments between verses. A memory here, a name there. He brought in Frank's old photos, his own medals, still in a rusted tin box. One day, he even played a vinyl recording of Billie Holiday, the very song Frank once called the voice of the war. Something began to shift in him, and in Emily too. She'd spent her life teaching technique, tone, posture, tempo, but now she taught something else. That music wasn't just notes on a page. It was survival, memory, legacy. Together, they transcribed Promised Winter properly for the first time. A clean, modern score with annotations about the original chords, the context, and Frank's story. Emily made copies for every student. They learned to play it in duets, trios, even full ensemble. Some sang harmonies. One senior choreographed a modern dance interpretation. It was no longer just a melody. It was alive. By December, they decided to host a performance. Not a big one, not a flashy showcase. Just a quiet evening recital at the school auditorium, open to families, veterans, and members of the community. Emily printed simple flyers, one song, one promise, one legacy. The night of the performance, the auditorium filled with quiet anticipation. On stage, a circle of students sat in folding chairs, instruments ready, hearts steady. At the center, one spotlight illuminated an empty wooden stool, and beside it, Walter's guitar. Emily took the microphone first. She didn't read from notes. She didn't make a speech. She simply told the truth. This song was written in a prisoner of war camp by a man who didn't make it home. It survived because someone kept a promise. Tonight, that promise becomes part of all of us. Then the lights dimmed, and the music began. It was slow, deliberate, layered, guitar, strings, voice. Each student adding their own part, not trying to perfect it, but to honor it. Behind them, projected on the wall, were images: Frank and Margaret, Walter as a young soldier, camp barracks, letters, the photograph, now preserved, no longer hidden in an attic. As the final note faded into silence, there were no cheers, no applause, only stillness, and the quiet hum of something ancient, something that had finally found its way home. Afterward, Walter didn't go on stage. He sat in the front row, hands clasped, tears on his cheeks. But when students filed out, they each stopped by him, not out of obligation, out of gratitude. And for the first time in his life, Walter McBride was not just the man on the bench with a guitar. He was the keeper of a story, now being told by many voices. Some reunions don't happen at airports or train stations. They happen in music rooms, when the past and the present sit quietly in the same key. Walter McBride passed away quietly, in the stillness of a cold January morning. There was no headline, no parade, no trumpet to announce his leaving. Just the quiet hum of an old radiator, a single lamp left on beside his worn recliner, and the faint scent of cedar and dust in the room. On his lap, resting like it always had, was his guitar, his only true companion through decades of silence. Next to it on the table was a sealed envelope addressed simply for Emily. Side, the original photograph, the hand-scribbled melody, and a single line in blocky, careful handwriting: "Now it's your turn to keep the promise." Emily didn't cry at first. Instead, she sat on the edge of her bed and read the letter again and again, the pages trembling in her fingers. She remembered how he spoke, slowly, always with that weight, not of sadness but of meaning. And she understood now more than ever what he had carried all those years. It wasn't just a song, it was a message, passed from one broken time to another, surviving not because it was loud, but because it was quiet, because someone had chosen not to forget. 2 months later, Emily organized a tribute, not at a church, not at a military cemetery, but in the high school auditorium where Walter had last heard his melody live. This time the room was full, not just of students, but of veterans, teachers, parents, neighbors, people who had heard fragments of the story, people who understood now what a promise sounds like when it's finally fulfilled. The program was simple: one melody, many voices. Each section of the performance was introduced with pieces of Walter's story, Projected behind the performers were clips from old interviews, wartime footage, images of the camp where Frank Delaney had once composed that haunting tune. The last performance was a solo, no instruments, just Emily at the microphone. She sang the melody slowly, without accompaniment, her voice steady, eyes closed, as if summoning not just sound, but spirit. And when she reached the end, she didn't bow. She simply whispered, "He kept his promise. Now it's ours to keep." The crowd rose, not in applause, but in silence. The performance was recorded and later included in a PBS documentary titled Songs Left Behind. Music from the front lines. Walter's story was featured in the New York Times, and the sheet music for Promised Winter was published online, free to download, with a message at the top. This piece was never meant to be sold, only passed on. And Emily? She still teaches the song. Every fall, she tells her students the story, not just about war or love or loss, but about the power of holding on to something when everyone else lets it go. She tells them about Frank, about Margaret, about Walter, and about how some melodies don't fade, they wait. We share new stories every day, true stories that move, inspire, and remind us what really matters. Subscribe to the channel and keep listening. There's always another melody waiting to be found.